Victoria Martinez stared at her phone, her heart hammering against her ribs as she read the babysitter's text for the third time. The words hadn't changed. Emergency. Can't make it today. 6 simple words that threatened to bring her carefully constructed world crashing down around her. Her gaze drifted to James, her 2-year-old son, who sat on their worn living room carpet, carefully stacking blocks with the intense concentration only a toddler could muster. The morning sun streaming through their apartment window caught his blonde hair, creating a halo effect that made her breath catch. In moments like these, he looked so much like him that it physically hurt. "What now, baby?" she whispered, more to herself than to James. The cleaning cart waited in her car outside, loaded with supplies for another day's work at Henderson Enterprises. She couldn't miss work, not when rent was due in 3 days, not when her entire life balanced on the precarious edge of each paycheck. Before we begin, please consider subscribing, as your support helps us create more meaningful stories for you. James looked up at her then, his startlingly blue eyes, his father's eyes, sparkling with innocent joy as he held up a red block. "Look, Mama." Victoria forced a smile, even as her mind raced through increasingly desperate options. No family in the city, no friends who could help on such short notice, and definitely no way to explain to her supervisor why she couldn't come in. They'd already written her up once this month when James had been sick. The irony wasn't lost on her that she cleaned floors in the very building where he made million-dollar decisions, that she scrubbed bathrooms 17 floors below the office where Maxwell Henderson probably didn't spare a single thought for that night 2 years ago. The night that had given her James, her blessing and her constant reminder of what happened when you let yourself believe in fairy tales. She glanced at her watch. 7:15 a.m. In exactly 2 hours, she needed to be starting her rounds on the 3rd floor, where the accounting department's trash cans waited to be emptied and their coffee-stained mugs needed to be collected for washing. 2 hours to figure out how to keep her job without revealing the secret she'd guarded for 2 years. James knocked over his tower of blocks, his delighted giggle echoing through their small apartment. The sound twisted something in Victoria's chest. Part love, part fear, part desperate determination. She had kept him safe and secret for this long. But as she looked at her son, then at her work uniform hanging by the door, she realized that today, fate had other plans. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that in less than 4 hours, her entire world would shift on its axis, all because of one word from her son's innocent lips. The elevator doors opened onto the 3rd floor of Henderson Enterprises with their usual soft ding, but to Victoria, the sound might as well have been a warning bell. She gripped the handle of her cleaning cart with white-knuckled fingers, hyper-aware of James's warm hand in her other palm. Every step down the carpeted hallway felt like walking through quicksand. "Remember what Mama said?" she whispered, crouching down to James's level. Her son nodded solemnly, his blue eyes wide beneath those impossibly long lashes. The same lashes she saw in every magazine cover featuring Maxwell Henderson, New York's most eligible CEO. "Quiet like mouse," James whispered back, making a little squeaking sound that under any other circumstances would have made her laugh. Victoria swallowed hard. "That's right, mi amor, and you stay right here with your toys while Mama works." She'd transformed a corner of the break room into a makeshift playpen, spreading out his favorite blanket and surrounding it with his toys. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. The first hour passed in a blur of anxiety and constant glances at James, who seemed content enough with his toys. Victoria cleaned on autopilot, her muscles remembering the familiar motions even as her mind raced. Empty the trash. Wipe down surfaces. Vacuum the carpet. Don't think about how any one of these employees could recognize James's resemblance to their boss. Don't think about how many company policies she was breaking right now. It happened during her 2nd floor rotation. Victoria had just finished restocking the paper towels in the women's restroom when Mrs. Chen, her supervisor, rounded the corner. Victoria! The older woman's eyes narrowed as they fixed on James, who was dutifully following behind his mother's cart. What is the meaning of this? The blood drained from Victoria's face. Mrs. Chen, I can explain. This is completely unacceptable. Mrs. Chen's voice carried down the hallway, drawing curious glances from nearby offices. This is a professional workplace, not a daycare center. Please, Victoria's voice cracked. My babysitter canceled last minute. I couldn't. You know the rules. Mrs. Chen's expression hardened. I need to report this to HR immediately. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Victoria reached for James instinctively, pulling him close as if she could shield him from the disaster unfolding around them. But James, picking up on the tension, began to squirm. Mama, he whimpered, pulling away from her grip. Bathroom. James, wait. The words had barely left her mouth when James broke free, darting down the hallway with the speed only a determined toddler could muster. Victoria's heart stopped as she realized which direction he was heading, toward the executive elevator bank. She ran after him, abandoning her cart and ignoring Mrs. Chen's calls behind her. But James had already slipped through the closing elevator doors, his delighted giggle echoing as the numbers above the elevator began to climb. 17. 18. 19. Victoria stared in horror as the elevator continued its ascent to the top floor, the executive floor, Maxwell's floor. 20 years of Catholic upbringing surfaced as she pressed her hands together in desperate prayer. Please, God, don't let him be in his office today. Please let him be at a meeting, on a business trip, anywhere but... The universe, it seemed, had other plans, because at that exact moment, 20 floors above, Maxwell Henderson was indeed in his office, and he was about to receive the surprise of his life. Maxwell Henderson sat at his desk, scanning through quarterly reports with the kind of focused intensity that had helped build his empire. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany surface. At 42, he had everything a man could want, except perhaps someone to share it with. The sound of small feet pattering across his marble floor barely registered at first. Then came a giggle, high-pitched, innocent, and completely out of place in an executive suite that hadn't seen a child in, well, ever. Maxwell looked up, his steel-blue eyes widening as they landed on a small boy standing in his doorway. The child couldn't have been more than 2, with a mop of blonde hair that caught the morning light and eyes that were a startlingly familiar shade of blue. "Hello." Maxwell set down his tablet, oddly captivated by this tiny intruder. The boy's face lit up with a smile that seemed to illuminate the entire room. "Hi." He toddled forward with the confidence of someone who had no concept of corporate hierarchies or social boundaries. Something tugged at Maxwell's memory. Something about that smile, those eyes. He stood up, walking around his desk for a better look at his unexpected visitor. "Are you lost, little one?" He crouched down to the boy's level, an unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest as the child beamed at him. And then it happened. "Daddy!" The word rang out clear and bright in the pristine office, stopping Maxwell's heart mid-beat. The world seemed to freeze. Maxwell stared at the child, really stared, and the pieces began falling into place with devastating clarity. The blonde hair that matched his own childhood photos. The blue eyes that were carbon copies of the ones he saw in the mirror every morning. The chin, the nose, even the way the boy's right eyebrow lifted slightly higher than his left. All perfect miniature versions of his own features. "James, James, where are you?" A woman's voice echoed down the hallway, thick with panic. A voice that sent Maxwell 26 months back in time, to a charity gala and too much champagne, and a night he'd tried very hard to forget. Victoria burst through the doorway, her cleaning uniform rumpled and her dark hair escaping its tight bun. She froze when she saw them, all the color draining from her face. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible. please, no. James, the boy's name was James, Maxwell's mind registered dimly, ran to his mother with a delighted squeal. "Mama! Found Daddy!" Maxwell stood slowly, his legs feeling unnaturally heavy. Memories crashed over him like waves. Victoria, in an emerald green dress at the Children's Hospital fundraiser, her laugh like music as they shared stories over dessert. The way she'd disappeared the next morning, leaving nothing but a lingering scent of jasmine and a note saying it had been wonderful, but she had to go. His half-hearted attempts to find her, thwarted by a fake phone number and his own busy schedule. "How long?" His voice came out rough, barely controlled. "How long have you been working in my building?" Victoria clutched James closer, her brown eyes wide with fear. "Maxwell, How? Long?" Each word felt like glass in his throat. 2 years, she whispered, since he was 3 months old. The magnitude of it hit him like a physical blow. 2 years. She'd been here for 2 years, cleaning his building, raising his son mere floors below his office. Every day he'd sat in meetings, closed deals, lived his life, completely unaware that his own child was so close. "You kept this from me." It wasn't a question. The rage building in his chest warred with an overwhelming sense of loss. "You let me miss 2 years of my son's life." "I had to protect him." Victoria's voice strengthened, though her hands trembled where they held James. "You don't understand." "You're right, I don't understand." Maxwell cut her off, his tone sharp enough to make James whimper and bury his face in his mother's neck. The sound sent a shaft of pain through his heart. "I don't understand how you could make this decision for both of us. How you could—" He broke off as his assistant appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene with wide eyes. "Mr. Henderson, your 9 o'clock is waiting in the conference room." Maxwell barely heard her. He couldn't tear his eyes away from James, his son, who was now peeking at him curiously from the safety of his mother's arms. "Cancel everything," he said, his voice distant to his own ears. "Clear my entire day." "Sir?" "Now, Sarah." The command in his tone brooked no argument. His assistant disappeared, leaving him alone with Victoria and the child who had just turned his world upside down. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria stood rooted to the spot, her world collapsing in slow motion. The pristine office suddenly felt too small, too warm, too everything. James wiggled in her arms, oblivious to the tension crackling between his parents. "Down, Mama," he insisted, and Victoria found herself automatically lowering him to the floor, her muscles moving on autopilot while her mind raced through scenarios, each worse than the last. James immediately toddled toward Maxwell's desk, drawn to a crystal paperweight that caught the morning light. Maxwell moved to intercept him, his large hand gentle as he guided James away from the sharp edges. The tenderness of the gesture made Victoria's chest ache. "He likes shiny things," she found herself saying, her voice barely above a whisper. "Especially blue ones, like his eyes." "Like your eyes," she didn't add, but the words hung in the air between them. "What's his full name?" Maxwell asked, his voice rough with emotion as he watched James explore the office. "James Alexander Martinez." Victoria swallowed hard. I gave him your middle name." Something flickered across Maxwell's face. Pain, rage, longing. She couldn't tell. "You gave him my name but didn't give him me?" "I couldn't risk." Victoria started, then stopped herself. How could she explain the fear that had driven her decision? The terror of watching her own mother work herself to death trying to raise 3 kids alone, only to have their wealthy father sweep in after her death and take them away? How could she make him understand what it was like to grow up torn between 2 worlds, never fully belonging in either? Risk what? Maxwell's voice was dangerously quiet. Risk me wanting to be a father to my own son? Risk me wanting to provide for him, to love him? Risk him becoming a part of your world, The words burst from her like water through a broken dam. Risk him becoming a public spectacle, splashed across tabloids as Maxwell Henderson's secret love child. Risk him being used as leverage in your next hostile takeover or corporate war. Risk, her voice broke, risk losing him. Maxwell stared at her, his expression unreadable. Behind him, James had discovered a framed magazine cover featuring his father and was pointing at it excitedly. Daddy, picture. The simple declaration seemed to deflate something in Maxwell. He sank into one of the leather guest chairs, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. You really think I would use my own son as a pawn? I think your world would, Victoria replied softly, whether you wanted it to or not. Silence fell between them, broken only by James's happy babbling as he continued his exploration of the office. Victoria watched as Maxwell's gaze followed their son's every move, drinking in details like a man dying of thirst. He has your smile, Maxwell said suddenly. When he laughs, that's all you. The observation caught Victoria off guard. She'd spent so long focusing on all the ways James resembled his father, she'd almost forgotten the parts of herself she saw in him. He's fearless like you, she found herself saying, always charging ahead, never doubting himself. Does he? Maxwell hesitated, vulnerability creeping into his voice for the first time. Does he ever ask about me? The question hit Victoria like a physical blow. He started to. Recently. He sees other kids with their dads at the park and... She trailed off, guilt twisting in her stomach. Maxwell stood abruptly, pacing to the window. The morning sun cast his profile in sharp relief as he stared out at the city sprawling below. When he spoke again, his voice was controlled, measured. I want to be part of his life. He turned to face her, his expression resolute. I have the right to be part of his life. Victoria tensed, preparing for the threat of lawyers and custody battles she'd always feared would come. But Maxwell surprised her. But I won't force it, he continued, his voice softening as he watched James attempt to stack some post-it notes into a tower. I won't drag him through courts or legal battles. I won't make his childhood about power plays and custody agreements. He took a deep breath. I want to earn my place in his life, in both your lives. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with promise and possibility. Victoria felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the unexpected turn this confrontation had taken. I don't want your money, she said firmly, needing him to understand. I've never wanted your money. I know. A ghost of a smile touched Maxwell's lips. That night at the gala, you were the only woman who'd ever turned down my offer to buy her a drink. Made me work for your attention. Made me earn it. The memory sparked between them, dangerous and electric. Victoria pushed it away, focusing on the present. If we do this, she said carefully, we do it slowly. On James's schedule, not ours. His needs come first. Maxwell's answer was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Chen stood in the doorway, her expression severe as she clutched a folder of HR documents. Mr. Henderson, I apologize for the interruption, but I need to address a serious violation of company policy. She broke off, finally registering the scene before her. James contentedly playing with office supplies, Maxwell standing protectively near him, Victoria looking simultaneously defiant and terrified. Mrs. Chen. Maxwell's voice carried the weight of 20 floors of corporate authority. I believe there's been a misunderstanding. Miss Martinez was here at my request. Victoria's head snapped up, surprise flickering across her features. Mrs. Chen's mouth opened and closed several times before she found her voice. Sir, she brought her child to work. My child. The words rang out clear and firm, sending a shockwave through the room. James is my son, and both he and his mother were here because I asked them to be. The color drained from Mrs. Chen's face as her eyes darted between Maxwell and James, no doubt cataloging the unmistakable similarities. I had no idea. No one did, Maxwell said quietly, his gaze meeting Victoria's. That's about to change, though, on our terms. He turned back to Mrs. Chen. Please cancel any disciplinary actions and give Ms. Martinez the rest of the day off, with pay. Mrs. Chen practically stumbled in her haste to comply, pulling the door shut behind her. In the silence that followed, James looked up from his makeshift tower of office supplies. "Mama okay?" he asked, his little forehead creasing with concern. Victoria crossed the room and knelt beside him, smoothing his hair. "Yes, mi amor. Mama's okay." She glanced up at Maxwell. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." He joined them on the floor, his expensive suit collecting dust as he sat cross-legged beside them. "I meant what I said about earning my place, but that doesn't mean I'll stand by and watch you lose your job because of me." James, apparently deciding the grown-ups were being boring, held out a post-it note to Maxwell. "Make plain?" Maxwell's face lit up with a boyish enthusiasm that transformed his features. "A paper airplane. I used to make those all the time when I was little." His fingers moved with surprising dexterity, folding the small square with precision. "My father taught me how to make them curve in the air." Victoria watched as James's eyes widened with delight when Maxwell launched the tiny paper plane, sending it swooping across the office in a graceful arc. The boys' squeal of joy echoed off the walls, shattering the last vestiges of corporate sterility. "Again," James demanded, already grabbing more post-its. "First," Maxwell said gently, "we should clean up the ones we already threw. Want to help me?" Victoria's breath caught as she watched James nod eagerly, toddling after Maxwell to collect the scattered paper planes. It was such a small thing, teaching responsibility through play, but it spoke volumes about the kind of father Maxwell could be. "We need to talk about what happens next," she said softly, once James was occupied with gathering planes. Maxwell nodded, his expression growing serious. "I know, and I know it won't be simple. The media will eventually find out, no matter how careful we are. My board of directors will have opinions. Your coworkers will talk." "I can find another job," Victoria started, but Maxwell shook his head. "Number. You're not losing your job or your independence. But," he hesitated, choosing his words carefully, "I'd like to offer you a different position, one that matches your actual qualifications." Victoria stiffened. "You looked me up?" "After that night at the gala, I knew you had an MBA from Columbia. Never understood why you wouldn't let me help you find work in finance." "I needed something steady," she said quietly. "Something that would let me be there for James. Banking hours are brutal for single mothers." "What if?" Maxwell watched as James successfully launched a paper plane of his own, clapping at his achievement. "What if we created something new? A position with flexible hours, working on our charitable foundation. The same foundation where we met, actually. It would let you use your degree, set your own schedule, and—" he smiled slightly, "maybe help other single parents who need support." Victoria felt tears threatening again. "You'd do that? For James? For you? I'd move mountains." He ran a hand through his hair, mussing it further. "But like you said, we take it slow, one day at a time. Maybe we could start with dinner. All three of us." James chose that moment to crash into Victoria's lap, paper airplane clutched triumphantly in his small fist. "Hungry, Mama?" A laugh bubbled up from Victoria's chest, surprising her with its genuineness. "Timing by toddler," she said, sharing a smile with Maxwell. "Always perfect." "I know a place," Maxwell said, his eyes twinkling. "Small Italian restaurant, amazing chicken fingers for James, and—" He paused meaningfully. the best tiramisu in the city. Victoria's heart skipped a beat. He remembered. That night at the gala, they'd talked for hours about their shared love of tiramisu, debating the best places to find it in the city. Okay, she found herself saying, surprised by how right it felt. Dinner. But Maxwell. He looked at her questioningly. No suits. She gestured to his impeccable attire. James is going through a spaghetti throwing phase. The laugh that burst from Maxwell was genuine and unrestrained, nothing like the polished chuckle he used in board meetings. It was the laugh she remembered from that night 2 years ago, the real man behind the corporate facade. Deal, he said, just as James launched another paper airplane that landed perfectly in Maxwell's leather briefcase. Though I think our son might have a future in aeronautical engineering. Our son. The words settled over them like a warm blanket, terrifying and comforting all at once. The small Italian restaurant was exactly as Victoria remembered it from their conversations that night at the gala. Checkered tablecloths, warm lighting from vintage fixtures, and the rich aroma of garlic and tomato sauce filling the air. But this time, instead of evening wear and champagne, they sat in a corner booth with a toddler between them and a pile of crayons scattered across the table. Maxwell had kept his promise about the suit, arriving in dark jeans and a casual blue button-down that made his eyes even more striking. He'd spent the last 20 minutes letting James teach him the proper technique for coloring a paper placemat dinosaur, his concentration as intense as if he were analyzing a merger proposal. "No, Daddy. Green," James insisted, pushing away the blue crayon Maxwell had selected for the Stegosaurus. Victoria's heart stuttered at how naturally James had taken to calling Maxwell Daddy. She'd worried it would feel forced or strange, but children had their own wisdom sometimes. James had recognized something in Maxwell that morning, something that went beyond physical resemblance or biological connection. "Green it is," Maxwell agreed solemnly, accepting the crayon from James's sticky fingers. "You're the expert here." The waiter appeared with their meals, chicken fingers and apple slices for James, fettuccine for Victoria, and Maxwell's spaghetti and meatballs that had made James's eyes go wide with delight. "Ball!" James reached for one of Maxwell's meatballs with lightning speed. "James, no." Victoria started, but Maxwell was already cutting one of the meatballs into tiny, manageable pieces and transferring them to James's plate. "Can't deny the boy his first taste of Antonio's famous meatballs," he said with a wink. "They're what made me fall in love with this place." Victoria watched as James carefully picked up a piece of meatball with his plastic fork, a skill they'd been working on for weeks. His face lit up at the taste. "Good," he declared, immediately reaching for another piece. "Like father, like son," Maxwell murmured, his eyes suspiciously bright as he watched James enjoy the food. The meal passed in a comfortable rhythm, punctuated by James's commentary on everything from the taste of his apple slices to the color of the candle flickering on their table. Victoria found herself relaxing despite her earlier anxiety, drawn into the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with her son, their son, and the man who was proving to be so much more than the corporate titan she'd feared. "I have something for you," Maxwell said as they finished their main course. He reached into a small bag he'd brought, pulling out a wrapped package. "Maxwell, you didn't need to—" "It's not what you think," he interrupted gently, placing the package on the table. "Open it." With slightly trembling fingers, Victoria unwrapped the gift. Inside was a leather-bound photo album, its cover embossed with a simple title, Our Story. "I had my assistant print these today," Maxwell explained as Victoria opened the album. The first page showed the charity gala where they'd met, a candid photo of them laughing together that she hadn't even known existed. "I want to fill it with new memories, but I thought we could start with where it began." Victoria turned the pages slowly. There were only a few photos from that night, but Maxwell had left dozens of empty pages, each waiting to be filled. The last page, currently holding a photo, showed today's date, with a simple picture he must have taken in his office. James's paper airplane collection, arranged carefully on his desk. "Look, Mama," James pointed at the empty pages. "More pictures." "That's right, mi amor," Victoria whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Lots more pictures to come." "Speaking of pictures," Maxwell said carefully, "I know we agreed to take things slow, but I was thinking. There's a park near here. They have those little boats you can rent, paddle around the lake. James might like that. And maybe we could take our first proper family photo." The word family hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. Victoria looked at James, happily smashing the remains of his chicken fingers into the marina sauce, then at Maxwell, who watched them both with such naked hope in his eyes. "I'd like that," she said softly. "But Maxwell? When we take that photo, could we take one with my phone? Something just for us, before—" She gestured vaguely, encompassing the world outside their quiet corner of the restaurant. Understanding dawned in his eyes. Before the rest of the world knows, before it becomes complicated. "Is that selfish?" Maxwell reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "It's human. And you're right. There will be enough cameras in our future. This moment should be just for us." "More meatballs?" James interrupted, his hopeful expression so similar to his father's that Victoria couldn't help but laugh. "How about dessert instead?" Maxwell suggested, signaling the waiter. "I seem to remember your mama has excellent taste in tiramisu." As they shared the dessert, James more interested in decorating his face with chocolate than actually eating it, Victoria felt something settle in her chest. The fear that had been her constant companion for 2 years began to loosen its grip, making room for something new, something that felt surprisingly like hope. They weren't a fairy tale. They weren't even a conventional family. But as she watched Maxwell teach James how to dip his spoon just so into the tiramisu, Victoria realized that maybe they were something better. They were real, imperfect, complicated, and entirely their own. And for now, in this moment with chocolate-smeared smiles and paper airplanes and briefcases, that was more than enough. It was everything. Sometimes the greatest riches in life aren't found in penthouse suites or corporate boardrooms, but in the innocent words of a child who sees past our carefully constructed walls. Love doesn't ask for perfect timing or perfect circumstances. It simply asks for the courage to open our hearts when fate gives us a second chance. And sometimes, just sometimes, the paper airplanes of destiny land exactly where they're meant to. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Your support helps bring more heartwarming stories like Victoria and Maxwell's journey to life. Remember, every story has the power to touch a heart, change a mind, and remind us that love finds its way in the most unexpected moments.